What are the issues regarding the way the information is portrayed and presented? There are many different issues. To start with, there is accuracy, and this means the accuracy of the information in the documentary. The accuracy of the information is important because it has to be accurate. A way of telling if the information is accurate is if the documentary has said where they found the information. An example of inaccurate sources of information is the documentary Amy. It has inaccurate information because the people who are interviewed were celebrities, which meant they only spoke of her when she was in front of lights and when she is hyped up with what she is doing. Therefore, they only spoke about her in a different light. They didn't interview people who saw her in her home and relaxed. The celebrities that were interviewed over-exaggerated Amy's life in the limelight. Any type of inaccuracy is bad because it means the information that the public are receiving is false. Therefore, they can only be held responsible if someone else uses that information. It is also important to get the information correct, because in documentaries there are normally interviews. Accuracy also includes the names of people that you interview, sometimes their job role, age, or gender. Balance of information is looking at multiple sides. It is also important to remember when doing documentaries. This means making sure that the information from both sides is being heard and conveyed properly. This means making an argument fair. It has to be an argument from all sides. It is important to remain as neutral and fair because the documentary isn't about your opinion on a topic. It's about showing the viewer both sides of the stories with accurate information, allowing them to make their own judgment of the topic of the documentary. A well-balanced documentary makes the audience choose the sides at the end of the documentary. It doesn't pick sides during the documentary and allows you to make up your own mind. Another example of a documentary which isn't very well balanced is Making a Murderer. This is not well balanced because it just focuses on one side and does not focus on the side of the law. It only interviews from the side of Stephen Avery. This includes his ex-girlfriend, his mother and father, and his lawyers. All the information is for Stephen and not against. The documentary makes you choose his side and doesn't allow you to see the other side, immediately making us choose Stephen's side. What are the different types of documentary? There is impartiality. Impartiality is only looking at the valid arguments and relies mostly on educated opinions. To make an impartial documentary, you have to gather relevant arguments and present them properly so they don't appear to be biased. It has to be balanced. Most murder cases are impartial until someone is proven guilty. And then there is objectivity, which is looking at multiple sides of the argument and making it unbiased. However, it is fact-based, so it relies mostly on facts and not looking at just one side. Cobain documentary is an example of this because it looks at his personal life and his rock star life. To achieve objectivity, you need to be able to ignore your own judgment whilst looking at all the facts. All the facts need to be accepted and analysed without your personal opinion getting in the way. A good example of this is cannabis, what's the harm? And lastly, subjective is the opposite of objective. It is not looking at multiple sides of the argument. It is very opinion-based, using only facts relevant to the agenda. However, it is not always negative. It is fine to state your opinion on a topic, but it is important that you mention it as your opinion and that it won't reflect the matter of the documentary. It is important that the document remains unbiased, although your opinion can be biased. What is the difference between opinion documentaries and biased? Opinion is used in various ways in a documentary because documentaries can be used to sway opinions in different directions or make their opinion heard. Opinion can come out in interviews in the documentary. When doing objective documentary, it is important to hear the opinion of everyone's side and not just one. If the documentary is subjective, it only needs opinions from one side. An example of a strong subjective opinion documentary is Making a Murderer because it only looks at one side. One opinion spoke over and over again by different interviewees. It is important to keep a balance while showing the opinions if you want to film an objective documentary. It is important when trying to keep an opinion fair because it shows too many opinions which have the same opinion and it will make the documentary seem biased towards that. This is something that you should try to prevent if you wish to keep a fair documentary. Whereas bias is having an opinion and not changing it for anyone else. This is normally the agenda of a factual programming. It is having an opinion and putting that opinion in the documentary, trying to get you to believe what the documentary believes. What other things needed to be considered as an issue when making a documentary? The first thing that needs to be considered is representation. Representation means different things for different purposes in a documentary. The first is the representing of information. An example of this is Coney 2012. This is basically how the information for the documentary is being presented. It is being shown properly or has been represented wrong and put in the wrong context. This also includes if the information is factually incorrect. Another example is people acting as representatives. This is when they act like they represent something like a category when they don't. For example, in Coney 2012, Jason Russell was acting like a force of good and the face of the invisible people when he wasn't the only person working in that job. He acted as a leader for the invisible people and a symbol of hope for the children of the company we're trying to help. Access is important when making a document. Access to location, access to information, access to equipment, and so on. To begin filming, sometimes you may need to obtain permission. This is because an area can be restricted for public use. Or if an area is public, you might need permission to film with the public around. If permission is not allowed, then you could be in trouble or even get a lawsuit filed against you. You also need to make sure that you have access to the resources that will supply you with the vital information such as internet, books, primary and secondary research. Privacy is an issue in factual programming because everyone has a right to deny being filmed and shown to the public. However, in some extreme cases for documentary, if the public are at risk, they are allowed to show someone against their will. Some documentary interviews can be withheld because if a crime is still being investigated, it could be breaking the law to show an interview with the person in question. And lastly, contract with viewer is a relationship between the documentary filmmakers and the audience. It is important because the filmmaker has to appeal to their audience. In order to do that, they must need to do at least primary research on what the target audience is. Can you analyse a documentary using the issues you have spoken about?
I have analysed Coney 2012, the documentary, using the understanding I have of the issues of factual programming. The first thing I noticed was the accuracy of information.
It's obvious that Coney should be stopped. The problem is 99% of the planet doesn't know who he is. If they knew, Coney would have been stopped long ago.
Because in the documentary there was no note of where they had received the information when he speaks about Coney to his child. Facts like 99% of the world don't know that Coney exists, but there is no link as to where they found that information. There is also no evidence that information is correct, because clearly they cannot ask the entire world's opinion if they know who Coney is. However, if this is incorrect, then this could be misleading for anyone watching the documentary. This will help the documentary get people on their team, but with false evidence. Another misguide with information is the way that there isn't a balance of information when Jason Russell, the main host of the documentary, is telling his son about Coney. He only speaks about the bad actions that Coney has done, and hasn't spoken about Coney's point of view. This can be seen as subjective and biased. This means the documentary is one-sided and viewers won't see more than one side, meaning the documentary may also sway the viewer to believe that the documentary side is the only side which is truthful. The documentary also takes an impartial and subjective approach too. Impartiality can be seen when talking about Coney in his interviews. They only speak to the people who agree with Jason. This can make the documentary very opinionated and make the viewer be on the same side as them. The way that the documentary makes it seem subjective is the way that Jason Russell is talking about his life and how he met a child called Jacob, and how he tried to help him. Another way that it is subjective is when Jason is speaking to his son about Coney. This is subjective because it is very opinionated based and only use parts of the information which is relevant for what Jason is talking about, instead of talking about the entire story. In doing this, the son only knows the parts which are really bad, which means when he gets interviewed, he can only comment on the really bad parts. Another thing that is biased is the way that Jason Russell acts as how he represents himself. In the documentary, Jason is acting as a force of good and the face of the invisible people, which means he is seen as the leader of the whole project. This impacts the documentary because it isn't based on the whole company of the invisible people. It gives the charity a memorable face which is willing to speak up and act as a leader. The different access approvals within the documentary would have to be cleared to make such things as access to information where Coney was and what he was doing. Jason would need access to photos of Coney and access to the schools in different countries. The access is important because if it is not granted, then such things, such as showing old footage of Jacob, wouldn't be allowed. So when Jason tells the story of Jacob, it would be less effective. The documentary also has to be careful of privacy because they aren't allowed to release information about the children that Coney has taken. This documentary uses lots of contract with the viewers because they have to get the point across of the documentary, that is, to get people to help them with their charity. So they have to use contract with viewers. This includes reaching their target audience. In this case, the target audience is anyone who would be willing to join their acts. Another way that they use contract with the viewer is by getting the audience involved in the documentary. At the end, referring to the viewers instead of ignoring them. Such things as "you can help us stop this" is addressing the viewers. What are the codes and conventions of the news? The first obvious one is the studio newsreaders, also known as newsreader or the anchor. The job of the anchorman is that they read out the news. At the end, they will close the program by saying goodbye. The codes and conventions of a newsreader are usually such things as shuffling the papers in front of them at the beginning and introducing themselves. They will usually have papers with the stories on, or laptops with the stories on, that they will be reading out for that day. They always look at the camera throughout the whole time until the end, when the camera pans away and the news anchors move to talk to each other. Sometimes news anchors will go outside the studio to deliver a story. These are usually called field reporters. They will broadcast outside when it is going live to the studio in real time. They will normally have the news anchors in the studio introduce themselves, so they don't have to introduce themselves at the beginning. If this is an interview based, the field reporter will walk into the shot and to where the interviewee is standing. At the end of the report, the field reporter will say "back to you at the studio." Another type of outside broadcasting is a thing called link to studio. This is when the news program that is currently on will cut to another live studio. This could be global or national. It is mostly used for global campaigns. What techniques would be used in news? An important one is mode of address. This is how news reports will look at the camera and how they will address the audience, whether it is direct or indirect. Direct is when the audience is looked at by the interviewee or interviewer, and the audience is normally addressed, speaking and referencing the audience in the filming. Indirect is the opposite, like a film, and they never reference the audience. News normally always have direct mode of address. Informal and formal mode of address. News is normally formal mode of address, dressed smart too. News rounds use informal because it deals with younger audience. Another thing to consider is interviews. The codes and conventions of news interviews include things such as lower thirds, which is a tab at the bottom of the interview. It will also have the name of the interviewee and some other information like job roles. The interviewer will use lots of different questions and question types. If it is a recorded interview, it may have a shot, reverse shot. Most interviews will try and make it look like a conversation because more information will come out and easily. If the interviewer isn't present, then the interviewee will look in the camera. However, if the interviewer is there, then the interviewer and interviewee will look at each other and start to make small talk. In the news, they will use experts and witnesses, also known as testimonials. This will usually be a field reporter asking someone for information on an incident spot. The field reporter will hold up a mic to the interviewee's mouth. This will be following the codes and conventions of a field reporter. An example of this would be Kai the Hitchhiker interview. Sometimes it will be an interview with an expert in a facility. These interviews are normally better planned than the interviews with random person on the streets. How do you structure a report? In the beginning of a report must start with the most important information to hook the audience in. This is normally called the lead. It can be short with no detail to the rest of the report, and it is an introduction into the report. This may include the what, where, who, how, and why questions briefly. These might include a quote from someone or a question that needs to be asked. This could be called the hook of the story. The second part is the body of the report. This is where the crucial information is released, including all the details. This can include the argument, controversy, the story, the issues, evidence, background story, details, and the logic behind it all. It'll also include quotes from the interview, photos, or videos from the segment, and audio. It is an expansion on the beginning lead. The last part is the tail. This is the extra information that needs to be spoken about, such things as relation to the report or link to something else interesting. What is actual footage?
Actual footage, also known as archive or actual footage, is when a news show will show something that has happened many years ago in a video format. Actual footage is used a lot within the news because it helps the reporters get the story across as well as providing the story to the viewers visually. After the footage is shown, a field reporter or an anchor person might go to the location report or a witness from the footage shown. What are the different documentary formats? There are 4 different types of documentary formats. There is exposition, observational, reflective, and performance. Expositional, or can be known as expository, is where a documentary educates and informs the audience. Most documentaries are expositional because they are made to teach or expand on a topic. An example is The Inconvenient Truth.
Another example is observational, also known as direct. The documentary filmmaker will observe and not become part of the documentary. However, these are the types of documentaries that will never be truthful because people will act differently with the camera around whether or not they mean to. Most also in documentaries use these type of formats because it cannot be staged. Reflective or self-aware is another type of format. This is used when the documentary will reference how it is a documentary and therefore can never be seen as truthful or real life because it makes it known that people act differently in front of the camera. An example of this is the Grizzly Man documentary because it shows the director and who made it, Werner Herzog, in some of the clips. It also shows the Grizzly Man making his documentary. Lastly, there is performance or performative. It is when the documentary filmmaker has taken the effort to reconstruct footage to support their agenda or aim. An example of this is Michael Moore. It is where some parts of the documentary are remade to make the documentary better. It might appear when talking about events that happened a long time ago and might benefit from visuals. What do realism, dramatization, and narrativization mean? Realism is when the events are filmed exactly as they happen. The subjects have to agree in advance to be filmed. Realism will show actual footage, also known as real footage. The techniques that would be used would be things like handheld camera footage, interviews with people involved in the topic or incident, statistics and graphs to support the facts. They may also show the setting up of camera before filming. Dramatization is the exaggeration built up within a documentary. It is basically creating a drama out of a real-life situation which will include things such as cliffhangers, voiceovers, music, and this will be done through a reenactment of the situation. Lastly, narrativization, which is normally always seen or heard in a documentary. Narrative is an effective way of addressing the audience and telling a story for the documentary. The narrative is always based on true facts and statements unless it is someone telling their side of the story.